I guess I better shut off the TV. Well, greetings, everyone. Sunday night. It's good. Well, in case you forgot, you should have been reviewing First Corinthians because tonight we start First Corinthians chapter 9. 8 through 10, I've said this about, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. 8 through 10 are one unit. And they should be read as one unit, and we oftentimes tear them apart, separate them, and that's what I'm doing. But, I'm not going to blame any other teachers because I'm not sure how I would do it any other way. Unless you want to stay for a 3-hour study, hey, that'd be a good idea. I'm game if you are. Speaking of 3-hour studies, starting tomorrow night, John's going to be doing a live feed. I'm guessing at 6:30. And it's not going to be a 3-hour live feed. But there's a pastor that John and I have both been very impressed with. John first started listening to him, and then I've listened to some of his teaching. And John's going to be using live feeds from this pastor. You will find him very interesting. And I believe John's going to be talking about or starting with some of the end time stuff. This guy's really good. And unlike most guys that are on YouTube, he's not on live TV, I don't think. But he's not out there begging for money. He is just out there to teach. And that amazes me because he's kind of young to have that kind of wisdom. It's not what we're taught these days. You know what I mean? So anyway, in this study tonight, we're in 1 Corinthians 9. And we finished with 1 Corinthians 8, kind of like meat being offered to idols and how we should deal with that. But in chapter 10, he's going to talk about, temptation and standing firm. And a lot of this is all about maturity. And, the Corinthians seemed to think they were mature, maybe more mature than Paul, some of them. But consider again here, what makes someone mature? Is it time? Certainly not. Some people can grow older and not grow wiser. Is it knowledge? The smarter you are, the more mature you are? Probably not. Perhaps it might be in how we deal with others. And that's what Paul's been talking about. But here in 8 through 10, he's especially talking about those we might, could, maybe consider weaker, spiritually speaking. Think about it. Paul mentions this also in Romans 14 and 15, a good place to go to supplement what he's teaching right here. And then there's 2 Corinthians 12:10. Not in this series, but shouldn't I do 2 Corinthians after 1 Corinthians? The two letters were written almost at the same time. And, there's other teachings about similar issues. See Matthew 18:4, Mark 9:35, Mark 10:43, Luke 22:26. I love Luke 22. Great place to go. So anyway, in this chapter, it appears that Paul's defending himself against those who have claimed that Paul is less than an apostle. So let's go back and review, the beginning of this book. In chapter 1, Paul discussed divisions within the church. Some said, I follow Paul, and others said, I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, meaning Peter, or I follow Christ. Don't you imagine this caused quite a bit of discussion, and that some of that discussion was in the manner of Paul's not really an apostle because he wasn't with Jesus, or Paul can't be a real apostle because he killed Christians. Oh, by the way, he did not. If you've been taught that, you're wrong. Whoever taught you is wrong. Go back and read Acts. Persecuted him, put him in jail, prison, whatever. Not killing. Not the best we know. Some would probably say Paul can't be a real apostle because he just teaches the simple stuff. Yeah. I think maybe sometimes even the mature Christians need to get the simple stuff again. Like in our Sunday morning study, we're doing a book called We Really Do Need Each Other. And the author says there is no place in the Bible where we can say, I have completed this, I'm done, I don't need to look at that anymore. I paraphrase his words, but he said that very clearly, and I agree with him. So in chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians, Paul talked about how he did not use eloquent speech. In chapter 3, he pointed out that he was given a milk, not solid food, simple teaching, because that was all they were ready for. That's what he said. And in chapter 4, Paul sarcastically reminded them how they seem to consider themselves so much better than himself or Apollos. When I say sarcastically, you need to go read 1 Corinthians 4 if you don't remember it being sarcasm. But let's take another look at 8 through 10 tonight. They seem to have a consistent theme, and that's food sacrificed to idols. It's in all three. How does chapter 9 fit in the middle of that discussion, remembering Paul didn't choose these divisions? Let's think about it as we go. Okay, verses 1 and 2. Paul says, am I not as free as anyone else? Am I not an apostle? Haven't I seen Jesus our Lord with my own eyes? Isn't it because of my work that you belong to the Lord? Even if others think I am not an apostle, I certainly am to you. You yourselves are proof that I am the Lord's apostle. So Paul opens out his defense by pointing out that he's indeed an apostle. The Greek word for apostle means one sent with a message, like an ambassador or emissary. In verse 2, Paul says, and that's Paul. He was sent with a message. Go read Galatians chapter 1 and see the story of Paul's beginning. In verse 2, Paul says, even if others think I am not an apostle, I certainly am to you. You yourselves are proof that I am the Lord's apostle. If you go back and look at Acts chapter 18, you will see that you will see what happens when Paul first arrived in Corinth. There was no church. So the very existence of a church in Corinth was a sign of their acceptance of his apostleship, since they accepted the message he was sent with. But let's see how Paul answers this charge that he's not an apostle. In verse 3, he says, "This is my answer to those who question my authority. Don't we have the right to live in your homes and share your meals? Don't we have the right to bring a believing wife with us as the other apostles and the Lord's brothers do, and as Peter does? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have to work to support ourselves?" Oh, Paul's continuing his defense here, and consider a couple of things he points out. Apostles had the right to stay in people's homes. That was the practice of the culture then. They didn't have Motel 6 or Super 8 if you'd rather. The Paul says had the right to be married and have their wife travel with them. Other apostles did it. Jesus' brothers did it. And even Peter did it. That's implying Peter not only was married, but he took his wife with him. I don't see anything wrong with that. What do you think? Perhaps because Paul and Barnabas had chosen to support themselves, some look down on them as not being real apostles. Then I guess I'm not a real pastor because I don't draw any money for what I teach. Perhaps you ought to go find somebody else to listen to. You know, somebody that gets paid a lot of money. That might make them better than me. Sarcasm intended. So in verse 6, Paul even mentions Barnabas in the middle of this. Acts 18 doesn't record his ever being in Corinth. I wonder if Paul's being with Barnabas was being used against him. Why would that be? Well, because Barnabas wasn't one of Jesus' disciples either. He was from Cyprus, the island. It's just a thought. I don't know. Paul continues with, let's read starting with verse 7, go all the way to verse 12. What soldier has to pay his own expenses? What farmer plants a vineyard and doesn't have the right to eat some of its fruit? What shepherd cares for a flock of sheep and isn't allowed to drink some of the milk? Am I expressing a merely human opinion, or does the law say the same thing? For the law of Moses says, you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. Was God thinking only about oxen when he said this? Wasn't he actually speaking to us, to his people, whether then or today? Yes, it was written for us so that the one who plows and the one who threshes the grain might both expect a share of the harvest. And that's Paul speaking there after my short interjection. Paul continues, since we have planted spiritual seed among you, aren't we entitled to a harvest of physical food and drink? If you support others who preach to you, shouldn't we have an even greater right to be supported? But we have never used this right. We would rather put up with anything than be an obstacle to the good news about Christ. It sounds to me like, tell me what you think. It sounds to me like Paul was facing the same problem we have today. And that's when I go out and talk to people, I hear first objection from most of the people I talk to. I don't want anything to do with the church. All they want is money. Give me money. Put money in the offering plate. Money, money, money. Money. Paul seems to be fighting against that. And he used the Old Testament and common sense, it would seem. He pointed out the errors in some of what has been said in Corinth. A teacher deserves support. You could also go to 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18, and Philippians 4, 16 and 19, and Acts 6, 2, to gain a better understanding of how apostles could be supported why they should be. And of course, 2 of those were written by Paul. 1 was written by Luke. But yeah, go fit 1 Timothy 5:17-18, Luke 10:7, Philippians 4:16-19, and Acts 6:2. In fact, 2 of those were written by Luke and 2 were written by Paul. Whatever. I didn't know how to count the first time. The 3 became 4 as I read it again. Paul's going to continue along those lines in 13 through 16. I'm going through this kind of fast, but I think you can get it, and you probably need to sit down and read it for yourself a little slower, trying to puzzle out all of this. I know I'm throwing out some extra references. You should check those. 13 through 16. Paul says, don't you realize that those who work in the temple get their meals from the offerings brought to the temple? People, stop. That's the Mosaic law. Not just the priests, but the Levites too. They benefit from the offerings being given, and they eat some, much, maybe even most, of the offerings, but some they cannot. Read the Mosaic law. Paul continues and says, those who serve at the altar get a share of the sacrificial offerings. All the Jews knew this. In the same way, the Lord ordered that those who preach the good news should be supported by those who benefit from it. Yet I have never used any of these rights, and I am not writing this to suggest that I want to start now. In fact, I would rather die than lose my right to boast about preaching without charge. I can relate to that one. But Paul continues, yet preaching the good news is not something I can boast about. I am compelled by God to do it. How terrible for me if I didn't preach the good news. I got all kinds of health problems. I've had a lot of opposition from other Christians in my ministry for various reasons. But people, I can relate to Paul. I'm not boasting that I'm a great preacher or that I have preached so many times. I'm boasting that God has used me. I can't stop myself. I'm going to be teaching, if not preaching, until the day I die. Unless I get totally dementia, and then look out, because I'll probably still be preaching. I've said it before, but Janet can testify. I preach in my sleep sometimes. Yeah, I do. And she said I also answer questions if she asks them when I'm talking in my sleep. Yep. Helps me stay honest. I don't need her finding out any secrets that I haven't told her. Know what I mean? So here Paul begins a section that, man, it almost seems like it's taken, well, if you take it out of context of this passage, has led some to say pastors should not be paid. I am not going to say that. The Bible doesn't say it. Go read those 4 passages I mentioned. And Paul writing to Timothy, Luke writing in the Gospel and in the book of Acts, and Paul writing to the Philippians. I am not going to contradict the Bible, which says that preachers ought to be paid. At least most of them, some of them, whatever. Read this in context of all of this. Paul saying he simply chose not to receive anything from Corinth, and that for that he's actually going to believes he'll receive a greater reward. I can tell you what the greater reward is. It may be more than this, but preaching the way Paul did, it warms your heart to know that I'm not putting any demands on the people. I'm just going to do what God called me to do. And if they listen to me, praise God. Oh. So in 17 and 18, Paul continues. He says, if I were doing this on my own initiative, I would deserve payment. But I have no choice, for God has given me this sacred trust. What then is my pay? It is the opportunity to preach the good news without charging anyone. That's why I never demand my rights when I preach the good news. Okay, so Paul reemphasized his point. He is allowed to be supported, but chooses not to be. In John 4:32, Jesus was responding to his disciples. Set the story. They got to a village in Samaria and they were hungry. It was midday. Jesus waited at the well and the disciples went to town to get food. Probably figured, he likes to be alone sometimes. We'll give him alone time. But while he's out there at the well, a woman comes. Now, usually the women didn't come in the heat of the day. They came in the morning, they came in the evening. This woman was not a good person. She'd been married multiple times and was living with a man she wasn't married to. The other women probably did not want her there when they were there. And she probably got the message. You know how we can be. Anyway, when the disciples came back, Jesus said, I'm not hungry. He'd been talking with this woman. And his response to the disciples, when they were surprised, he told them, I have a kind of food you know nothing about. Don't you think Paul would have said the same thing? Do you truly understand this point? It's an important point, people. Serving God is more fulfilling than eating the best comfort food in the world. And I love comfort food. I've said it before and I'm going to say it again, but my family and those very closest to me that I consider family, they used to worry about me traveling by myself because I get wrapped up in teaching and I forget that I'm diabetic. I need to watch my insulin, maybe take it. Maybe I took too much and I need to eat something. And there are signs you can see on a diabetic. If you have somebody that's a diabetic, you should be learning those. But when Coaster joined my life, he traveled with me and he took good care of me. He made sure I followed the rules I needed for my health. Rules that, frankly, I sometimes forget because I get so wrapped up in the ministry. I wish everyone would get that wrapped up in ministry. That's what Paul's talking about here. In verse 19, he continues, even though I am a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those that follow the Jewish law, I too lived under that law. Even though I am not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I'm with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so I can bring them to Christ, but I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. I love this passage in the next paragraph as well. Paul indicates he will do whatever it takes to win souls. He's a free man, but will become a slave. When he's with the Jews, he lives like a Jew. When he is with the Gentiles, he lives like a Gentile, but he always obeys God's word. When I talk to people, I talk to people at all segments and levels of society. And you know what you have to learn to do? You have to learn to speak their language. And no, I'm not saying accents and everything. But when you're with hoity-toity people, they want to use big words. You need to use a few. When you're with the common everyday cowboy or biker or street person or factory worker, big words, maybe they impress them, but they don't understand them sometimes. That's not an effective way to preach. Paul says, basically, like in verse 20 through 23, he says, when I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness. For I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone. doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessing. Paul says, if you think I'm weak, fine. I want to read 22 and 23 to you from different translations. I enjoy this verse. In the New Living, it says, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessing. I love the NIV most of all of these, and let me read it. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Yeah, but wait, the New King James, that's pretty good too. I've become all things to all men that by all means save some, that I might by all means save some. I do this for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you. The Message Bible. Oh, this should be interesting, don't you think? Paul says, I've become just about every sort of servant there is in my attempts to lead those I meet into a God-saved life. I did all this because of the message. I didn't just want to talk about it. I wanted to be in on it. When he says, I did all this because of the message, you think maybe this is the verse they were looking at when they named the Message Bible? Probably not. There are a lot of verses that they could have been looking at say something similar. But wise or ignorant, white collar, blue collar, rural or suburban or urban or inner city, cultured or crude, regardless of race, we should all reach out to all. I think that's very important. Continuing in verse 24, Paul says, and I ask you to consider him saying it directly to you. He says, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away. But we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I am not just shadow boxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. Okay, in verse 24, he says, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs? He's talking about our lives. And he says, so run to win. How many Christians do you know that aren't even running? They aren't even engaged in the Christian life other than going to church on Sunday and not using God's name in vain and doing a couple other good things. Paul says we need to live a disciplined life. We shouldn't run aimlessly. We should have a goal. If we don't discipline ourselves, we may fall. I believe this to be one of the downfalls of pastors who build a big church and become full of themselves, a lack of discipline. I also believe this paragraph addresses one of the major issues in modern Christianity, a lack of disciplined training with regards towards advancing their knowledge of Christianity and God's law. When I was just a wee little lad, well, maybe a little bigger than that, because I probably left that at 3. Ask my mom, I don't know. I wasn't real little for a long time. Churches, the churches my parents went to anyway, they had Sunday morning Bible school for everyone. Sunday school, they called it in most churches. And they had about an hour for every age and grade, including the adults. And then they had worship service. And back then, I'm thinking of one pastor in particular. His nickname was Rev. a chunky old man, old to me anyway. He'd get out and play volleyball with the young people. He wasn't afraid of making a fool of himself. He wasn't ashamed of not being the best, but he did whatever it took to reach people. And by the way, he did not do that 22-minute sermon everyone's looking for today. I didn't watch the clock. Wasn't real interested in Christianity. Something wrong in me. But this man could grab your attention. And I think he went 45 minutes more than he did 25 minutes. And he taught. He taught. So Sunday night, he taught some more. We just had church. He taught some more. And then Wednesday night, we got more teaching. Today, most Christians go to church once a week and say, that's good enough. Rev would say, well, you can always get together in between services. I don't remember how he said it, but that was the feeling I got from him. We left there when I was moved to another state. You ever get to sit down with my mom? Ask her about Rev. Gordon K. Peterson. Truly a man of God. All right, we're done with chapter 9. I do have a question for you. I mean, a serious question for you. Which one is weaker? The one who refused to eat meat that's offered to idols? Or the one who eats the meat offered to idols because others eat that meat? Which one is the weaker one? Let's apply it into modern world. We think that because we've been in the church longer, because we've been a Christian longer, that we are stronger than those brand new. So if we tell them what you're wearing is inappropriate, or you can't smoke cigarettes, or you can't drink booze, or can't use that kind of language, because you might make someone stumble, implying somebody like me. Of course, I'm too strong to stumble, but, somebody like me. Isn't the one that we're afraid might stumble, including ourselves, isn't that the one that's the weaker one? I think sometimes the new Christians are stronger than the mature Christians. Think about it. All right, so 1 Corinthians 10 should take, 10, 15 minutes to read. Read it 2 or 3 times using a couple different translations. As you read this, try and line it up with 1 Corinthians chapter 8, because it's specifically talking about meat offered to idols. Does it give you the same feeling? Or does it feel like a stronger or weaker declaration of Paul's position? In this chapter, Paul gives us a whole bunch of Old Testament quotes, examples for our benefit. How about I say it that way? You can find these for yourself. I did not look up the passages. I just pulled these off the top of my head. I apologize. I must have been tired not to go look them up. But under the cloud and passed through the sea, the Red Sea crossing, they all ate the same spiritual food. And be careful with that one, because it's not talking about all the Israelites. They drank from the spiritual rock. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in pagan revelry. Those don't go together, but 23,000 died. Look that one up. They were killed by snakes for testing God. And they were killed by the destroying angel. Why? What can we learn from all that for us today? And then for those overachievers among us, take a look at 1 Corinthians 11:1 and tell me, do you think that belongs in chapter 10? Or does it really belong in chapter 11? And explain yourself. At least write it down so you'll understand what you're saying. God bless you. I love you. May this week be one filled with his blessings upon your life so that you may share those blessings with others. Amen.